Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 9 class. We're in Unit 4, Gunpowder the Sale and Absolute Rule, Part E. Absolutism and the Puritan Revolution, 1600s to 1688. So, this is coming off of our last set of notes, which explored political absolutism on continental Europe. The rise of the Bourbon dynasty in France, Louis XIV, and his absolutist rule. He's the model of the absolute ruler, as well as absolute autocracy in Russia as well. And what we're going to see is during this period where absolutism is on the rise in continental Europe, the European nations, in England, they're undergoing some very different experiences. And while the kings of England will try to be absolute rulers, the English people will push back against that and basically lead their country into the beginnings of what will be a democracy and a democratic republic. And if you're wondering in part where the American colonists got this idea that, government should have representation, no taxation without representation, it is in fact, in part, a legacy of this Puritan revolution, and we're going to see an English Civil War. So, STQs, what is absolutism? How was it defended as a policy by European leaders? Like, what argument did they have that this is what it should be? And of course, we know that's the idea of divine right. In what ways was England's experience with absolutism different from other European nations? Describe the causes and the effects of the following events: the execution of Charles I and the Glorious Revolution, which you'll probably have a CRQ on. What decisions and actions did Parliament in England undertake to assure a check on political absolutism? So let's dive into this reaction to absolutism in England. From 1485 to 1603, England had been ruled by the Tudor dynasty. This included some of our famous guys we talked about and girls. Henry VIII, who split England from the Catholic Church with the 1534 Act of Supremacy and created the Reformation Anglican Church, or the Church of England, as well as Elizabeth I, one of the finest rulers that England ever had, a powerful female figure who oversaw a golden age in England, the establishment of overseas colonies, political and religious stability throughout her reign, as well as the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the growth of the middle class. And these two individuals are absolute rulers. Like, they called the shots, but they acknowledged that they had to work with Parliament, which was England's legislative body, composed honestly mostly of very wealthy individuals. The poorest would be very upper middle class, composed in many parts by landowners and things like that. However, Elizabeth I died without an heir. She never married, she never had children, and so rule would pass to her nephew, who was of a different family known as the Stuarts. And so in 1603, the Stuart dynasty takes over with the rule of James I. Now, James I was already a king. He's James I, King of England, but he was James VI, King of Scotland. So he already knew how to rule. He already knew how to delegate political authority and stuff. And so in this act of inheriting the throne of England, he becomes simultaneously the King of Scotland and the King of England, and he moves to London to rule England because it's, the larger of the kingdoms. Now, James I, pictured here in two different pictures, a court painting as well as a stylized woodblock print, he believed in political absolutism. He believed in the divine right to rule. He was a very religious individual. He was also a very intellectual individual, having written numerous treatises on political power, religion, even scientific treatises as well. Very interesting guy. And so he wrote a very famous text known as Basilicon Doran, which roughly translates into the royal gift. And it's in a political treatise, a political book, defending divine right, but also saying a king must not be a tyrant. He must not be an evil king. He must rule for the betterment of his people. You got this great quote from him from Basilican Doran. The sovereign, the king, knew best the interests of his subjects, better than they themselves. And this is the idea that, the king as an educated individual, born and raised to rule, is a better ruler than a mob of people that might be uneducated. And another great quote, a deo rex, a rege lex, the king is from God and law is from the king. So very much your divine right ideas here. Now, James I will lead England into some expensive wars. And these are wars that don't necessarily win a lot of territory or wealth for England. They're not, they're not useless wars. They do help expand the naval power of England, but they don't really win them territory, win them great wealth. And these wars are not super, super popular with all of Parliament because, well, it's expensive to fight war. And when Parliament kind of brings up hey, bro, you're Scottish, that you're not really an English dude, maybe you should, chill back a little bit, calm it down. He's angered by that because, again, he believes in divine right. So he dissolves Parliament. He says, yep, I don't need to meet with you. You guys aren't really necessary for me ruling. I am divinely appointed by God to govern England and Scotland. I'll make my own decisions. And he began to impose his own taxes, which was kind of a big no-no in England. If you remember, that was some of the reasons why King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, because the people felt like he was overtaxing them. His religious views also angered the Puritans, which was a religious minority in England who wanted to purify the Church of England of anything they saw as a remnant of Catholicism. Some of the rituals of the Anglican Church, some of the vestments, the robes worn by the priests, they're like, that smells like papacy to me. And he's like, yeah, but I like it, so we're going to keep going with that. Amazingly enough, there actually was a Catholic plot to assassinate King James I and take out most of Parliament as well. This is the famous gunpowder plot of 1605. And so what happened is a bunch of secret Catholic lords and individuals were going to stack keg upon keg of gunpowder underneath Parliament, set for the 5th of November when the king was going to go there and give this speech. If this was successful in one fell swoop, the king, who was, an Anglican, a Protestant, if you will, would be killed, as well as most of the bishops and leading members of the Anglican Church and most of the Parliament who were also Protestant. And so this would have disrupted English government, and the Catholic lords who were not going to show up to this meeting would be able to claim power for themselves, set up basically a young girl as the Catholic queen and rule through her. But it failed. One of the plotters, one of the conspiracists, they got cold feet. They sent an anonymous letter, and the guards started to search through the basement of Parliament, and they found all this gunpowder, and they found this guy named Guy Fawkes. So he was the guy who was going to kind of light this powder keg off. The conspirators were rounded up. They were executed. They were tortured to death, drawn and quartered, their entrails, their intestines cut out of them and rolled out piece by piece in front of them. It actually doesn't kill you all that fast. And your intestines actually don't have a lot of nerves. So really you just watch in terror as your organs unravel in front of you. Pretty intense stuff. But today, the picture of Guy Fawkes has been used by Anonymous and other hacker groups that rebel against the government. So kind of an interesting continuity and change thing going on. So James I dies, and he leaves as his heir Charles I. Charles I becomes King of England in 1625, and immediately has disagreements with Parliament over how much authority and power the monarch, the king, the sovereign should have. He, like his dad, believes in divine right. He, like his dad, believes in absolutism, but arguably where his father, kind of towed the line, Charles I steps over that line. He begins to imprison political enemies without trial, just throwing them in the dungeon, being like, yeah, well, you don't get a trial, including powerful political leaders in Parliament. He imposes high taxes without Parliament's consent, and he makes religious changes to Anglican rituals that anger both the Puritans and Scotland, even though he's technically, Scottish per se, his own people are not too happy. A lot of them felt like he was not Reformation-y enough, that, the Anglican Church under him and under his father still smelled too much like pseudo Catholicism. They're still denying the authority of the Pope, but they kept too much other Catholic ritual. And so effectively, Parliament says, we're not giving you a dime. We're not authorizing you to go to war. You can't do anything until you sign this petition of right, this document outlining the rights of English people. It said the monarch is not supposed to tax unless Parliament agrees to it. The monarch cannot keep soldiers in people's private homes, which is also in our Constitution, if you didn't know that. That's where we got the idea. The king cannot force loans or arrest people for not paying them. That's one of the ways Charles started raising money. He started being like, hey, rich dude, can you loan me some money? And when they're like, no, I don't think it's a good idea to do that, I don't know if I'll get paid back, he would arrest them. And he says, and the petition right said, you have to charge people with crimes. If you arrest them, they must be charged with a crime. They must get a timely trial, and so their guilt can be determined. And he does sign this, but in anger, he goes, all right, well, fine. I'm just not going to need new tax money. I'm not going to meet with Parliament. He dissolves Parliament just like his father had. For 11 years, Parliament doesn't meet. And Charles I is basically able to get along. He can't really do a lot. He doesn't have a lot of income, but he's able to govern England more or less effectively until the Scottish Rebellion. The Scots basically are sick of these religious changes. They feel like their political needs are not being met, and so there's a rebellion against English rule. And now, to put down this rebellion, which actually initially was so effective, the Scots invaded England, and it's like, oh, this might be really scary. He has to ask Parliament for money because he can't raise it without their permission. And so the Parliament meets again, and their leaders, again, all rich nobles and powerful members of the church, are like, yeah, we'll give you money to fight against this rebellion, but there's going to be some changes. We need to meet regularly every year, and we want sole control over taxation. No taxation without representation. They didn't say that, but that was the gist of their idea. And Charles is infuriated. He's like, what right do you to have the challenge the right of me, God's representative, God's leader and chosen ruler on earth? And so he goes with some armed guards and he tries to arrest members of Parliament. And this is shocking to Parliament. Like, there's no charges, there's no nothing. You're just going to come here and you're going to arrest elected members of the government. That's not cool. And so this then leads to the English Civil War, where Parliament and people that follow Parliament and believe in them as an agent of legislative change are going to fight against the autocratic and absolutist theory of the rule of the king. And here's Charles I trying to arrest members of Parliament. This is an anti-parliamentary political cartoon that shows Parliament as like this angry, many-headed demon monster that is trying to attack the city of London. So the English Civil War is a long, violent, drawn-out conflict. It lasts 7 years, almost a decade of civil war. And civil wars are always very, very brutal because every person that dies is a member of the same country. The English Civil War, and I'd like you to star this because it gets confusing, is sometimes also called the Puritan Revolution. So it's a civil war, English people versus English people, but some people say, well, it was mostly driven by the middle class Parliament and the Puritans, which made up the majority of Parliament, and so we should call it a revolution. And either term is acceptable in your writing. I know I hate when things have multiple terms, but sometimes it's just the way of history. So what is it? It's fighting between Parliament and the Puritans who support it, and it's led by Oliver Cromwell, a very, very devout Puritan with his Roundhead army. They were called Roundheads because they had shorter haircuts, and also because they had this round style iron helmet, steel helmet. Who were they? Mostly Puritans, a lot of country landowners, but not necessarily members of the nobility, a lot of middle class townspeople, and a lot of middle and upper class merchants. They are fighting against the royalists, those who support the royal king, and his cavaliers, they were called, his knights essentially. And they supported the power of the monarch. Who were actually fighting in this army? Mostly large landowners and members of the nobility and the aristocracy. So, what you have essentially is a war of the people against a war of the wealthy landowners and the nobles. And you can see here on this chart, you can see that the nobles mostly in this war, as the war progressed, control parts of the north and parts of the west, while the parliamentarians had strong control over most of the east and the south for most of the war until the end, when, then the royalists are getting defeated more and more. Oliver Cromwell comes in, loses a couple battles, and decides, you know what? Our army's not working. We got to make some serious major changes. His changes focusing on gunpowder infantry and pikemen. A pike is a very long spear, and so you would use formations of matchlock guns, like an early type of musket, and they'd be backed up with these long 12 to 18-foot spears. So the guns take a long time to fire, so while people are reloading, you didn't want to get charged by horses and knights and get hacked to pieces. So the spearmen, the pikemen, would be able to keep those horses at bay, because these big long spears would, stab the horses, and horses don't like charging into spears, so they would, like, a lot of times neigh and kind of back off a little bit. And so with these changes to the military, and arguably Cromwell's, discipline in the military, being like, we are going to train, we are going to drill, we're going to know what to do, they won several crucial battles, and they actually captured King Charles I. But now what? Like, you've rebelled against your king, but this was never about, like, Cromwell becoming king, or at least in the beginning it wasn't. So what do you do now? Well, Parliament decides to put Charles I on trial. And this is the first time a king has been put on trial by his own people. It's ground shaking, it's earth trembling. And they find him guilty of treason. And the only punishment for treason back then was execution. So they put the king on trial, they cut off his head, and that's it. That ends the Civil War. It's crazy. These are the charges against Charles I, accused of treason against England by using the king's power to pursue his personal interests rather than the good of the country, for the accomplishment of such as the king's designs, and for protecting of himself and his adherents in his and their wicked practices. To the same ends the king has traitorously and maliciously, evilly, waged war against Parliament and the people therein. He's had wicked designs, wars, and evil practices of him, the said Charles Stuart, have been and are carried on for the advancement and upholding of his interest and will, his personal power, and the pretended rights to himself and his family, against the public interest, against the common right, against liberty, freedom, justice, and peace of the people of his nation. So some pretty intense crimes they accuse him of, and they find him guilty. So what now? Well, after Charles I's execution, Parliament decides to get rid of the monarchy. They're like, we don't really need a king. They also abolished the Church of England and moved very aggressively towards Puritan ideas and Puritan beliefs, because again, the majority of Parliament were Puritans. I would like to point out, the majority of English people, like the commoners, they were not Puritan. This is kind of like this religious minority forcing their will on England. England becomes a republic with its leader as Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell then views Ireland, a neighboring island, as an enemy. He says that they have continued to be Catholic. This is a Catholic dagger pointed at the spine of England. And so he invades and is brutal, leading to mass human rights violations. He would burn crops, execute villagers. He would destroy food so the Irish would starve to death. That's effectively how he won. I mean, he did defeat Irish soldiers and armies in battle, but what really made the Irish surrender was the fact that he was just destroying the countryside, and there were massive famines, and the Irish were like, well, we can't do this. Like, our women and children and elderly are dying. And so he rules Ireland and joins Ireland essentially as a colony. It gets colonized by the British. And then he returns to England. And what he realizes is Parliament is like difficult to deal with. That they're like, oh, we don't like this. Man, we didn't vote on this. And so, acting like an absolutist, he also disbands Parliament and he rules as a dictator for several years. Because the military was loyal to him, you could not question him or he'd arrest you. And he leads England based on his own Puritan beliefs. So he outlaws dancing, he outlaws theater, he closes the famous Globe Theater of the Shakespeare Acting Company. He canceled Christmas. He canceled bright and colored clothing, happiness, joy, playing cards, drinking, gambling. Pretty much anything fun is outlawed. And when he dies 5 years later, his son tried to take power, and the English people, like across the country, are like, oh, hell no. We like Christmas. We like clothes that have color besides black, white, and gray. We liked going to dances. We liked music. We're not doing this. And so essentially his government collapses. So what happens next? Well, they had a king and he was kind of a jerk, so that didn't work out. They tried this republic thing and it just turned into a dictatorship. So they're like, you know what? Let's try doing the king thing again, but like, let's have the king work with Parliament. So in 1660, you have the Restoration. I'd like you to star that, please, if you will. What Parliament does is reach out to Charles I's son, Charles II. And they're basically like, hey, bud, sorry about the whole killing your father by cutting his head off thing, but would you like to come back from exile? He had been living with his family in exile in France, and like restore the monarchy and rule with Parliament hand in hand. And shockingly, Charles I says yes. He's like, oh yeah, you know what? I get it. You killed my dad. Things had to be done. Angry words were said. But yeah, I'd like to be King of England again. And Charles II actually gets along really, really well with Parliament. He does believe in divine right. He does believe that the king should be powerful, but he also does recognize the rights of Parliament. He meets with them regularly, and things go well for 25 years. But, and this is a big unfortunate but, Charles II never had any children that lived to adulthood that could inherit the throne. And so when he dies, leadership, the monarchy, the kingship passes to James II, his brother. And James II is wildly unpopular. I mean, look at the painting. The painting alone, the artist made him sneer. And so he is unpopular. He tries to rule like his father had as a straight up absolutist. He also is a secret Catholic. In France, he had been very much attracted to Catholicism. And so he marries a Catholic wife. His son, he is thought to have been baptized in the Catholic Church. He's very arrogant. And when he has his son become a Catholic, that's kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Because the people of Parliament, the people of England, who are, embracing the Protestant Reformation, who are part of this Church of England, they realize when James dies, his son will be Catholic. And this could lead to more civil wars, more religious instability. They do not want that. They have to find another Protestant, another Church of England member to sit on the throne. So they reach out to James the Second's sister. That's James the First's daughter, Mary. She had been married off to a Dutch noble named William of Orange, because the area he controlled was called the Duchy of Orange. And Parliament like secretly sends this dude letters, sends this guy representatives and say, "Hey, Mary and William, you guys are Protestants. Mary, by her relation to the former King James the First, she couldn't technically inherit the throne. Would you guys like to come back? If you invade England with an army, Parliament will support you, and you get to be King and Queen of England." This is known as the Glorious Revolution. Star the heck out of this. This is a major turning point of 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Why is it a turning point? Mary and William are both Protestants, so this will ensure Anglican Protestant rule in England even to this day. James II, rather than fight a civil war, flees. When William of Orange lands with his army, and James II is like, I don't want to get my head cut off like my dad. I'm out of here. That means there is no civil war. It's a bloodless transfer of power. So that's one of the reasons they call it glorious, is like it didn't lead to another decade of constant fighting. And it's also glorious, and I'd like you to star this, because to inherit the throne, Parliament said William and Mary will have to sign and agree to this foundational document of democracy, the English Bill of Rights, which limited, legally and formally, the power of the monarch. Parliament would be in control of taxing. People could not be punished for axing the king to fix problems. No cruel and unusual punishment, no more torture, execution, and the right to a fair trial for everyone. This is game changing. Like, this is what will inspire American colonists to fight for freedom and representation. So what does the English Bill of Rights say? It says that the monarch must meet with Parliament regularly. No more disbanding Parliament because you don't agree with them. Parliament will control all taxes. No taxation without agreement with Parliament. That banned excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment, and affirmed a right known as habeas corpus. It roughly translates to present the body. It means no one in England can be imprisoned without being charged with a crime first. Parliament itself gains the freedom of speech, and it would dictate that Parliament will hold regular elections. So these are moves towards democracy. The effect of this, why it's such a turning point, besides giving English people all these rights, because it makes England start a limited or constitutional monarchy. It's a monarch, they have a king and queen, but they're limited in power. They are bound to a constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. It says that the legislative body, Parliament, now has the right of taxation and the right to limit a king's power. And this will eventually develop into a parliamentary democracy. So it's a major game changer. It will influence other movements towards democracy, including the American colonists, including later on the French Revolution. And it is arguably one of the reasons why you see England get more and more powerful, is these rights and powers given to the English people. And it is an extension thereby of the Magna Carta of 1215 in expanding the rights of the English people.